More than a month from the start of the war in Ukraine, the town of Bucha, just north of Kyiv, was under the control of Russia's 64th Motorised Infantry Brigade. On its return home, the brigade was given an honorary title by President Vladimir Putin in recognition of what he described as its mass heroism and valour. But after Bucha was liberated by Ukrainian forces, a different mass was in the discussion in the news, a mass grave which was discovered at the church and bodies left lining the streets where they fell. Thousands of war crimes have been documented by investigators, and 10 individual Russian soldiers in particular are now being hunted by Ukraine for various crimes including torture, rape and what is described as premeditated murder. 64th Motorised Infantry Brigade is back in Ukraine. It's on the front line of the battle for the Donbass region. Well, let's talk now to Colonel James Stuart, who's spent more than 30 years serving in the military. His career began during the Falklands War in 1982 as a young officer in the Scots Guards, fighting with his platoon in close quarters against the enemy on Tumbledown Mountain, a name, of course, that went on to become very famous. Since then, he has had tours in Northern Ireland and served in Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, amongst others. He now is a director of Pavocat. That's a company that trains about the law and advises on the behaviour of armed forces in battles. Thank you very much for being with us, Colonel. Can I ask you, first of all, can you offer any explanation as to why some Russian soldiers may be acting in this way?
Thank you very much for having me on. I think so. I think it comes down to three areas, really. The first is the checks and balances. Over here, we have a military justice system, things that we take for granted. Over there, as you just said, they get medals rather than a court-martial. The second thing, I think, is that the chain of command knows that the international community's response is one-dimensional. The International Criminal Court, which is paralysed. Also, they've done it before. They did it in Chechnya, they did it in Syria, and there were no consequences for behaving like this. And I think all of that culminates in servicemen and women doing what they're told, which is a very Russian habit, as by and large their relationship with authority is not to question whether they're in uniform or out of uniform. I think the second big reason is they don't get training in this. So how can a tank gunner calculate whether shooting at an apartment block is the wrong target? But I think the last point, and it's the most complicated and the most nuanced one, is culture. Of course, there are good moral people in Russia and in their military. Their submarine service is a particularly praiseworthy example. But like every military, they're a mirror of society. And in Ukraine, the military society comes mainly from two oblasts, one in Siberia and one in Terek. That means they're joining on contract for money and something to do. And they bring with them into uniform baggage. And that baggage is a number of things. The first is they are brought up on propaganda, which particularly dehumanizes the enemy. And we know where that leads. The next thing is they're brought up around threats, doubts and uncertainties themselves. By and large, they're poorly educated and they're utterly uncertain about what is the truth. They also tend to see themselves as victims, not aggressors. And they don't really therefore confront reality and they don't take responsibility. It's not the Russian way. So I think all of those three things together mean that what happens is that the private soldier abrogates his responsibility of saying no, puts aside his moral compass, and does things that we would consider in the West to be wrong.
I think I saw a quote, I think The Economist last week quoted Trotsky as saying an army is a copy of society and suffers from all its diseases, usually in a higher temperature. So, I mean, there may be, as you say, a cultural question here, but also presumably there's a very practical question about kind of, you don't necessarily do something if you fear getting caught. What could be done about that in the context of, we've already seen those terrible crimes in Bucha, which we've talked about. in trying to prevent a repetition of those crimes, both for the duration of this war, however long it lasts, and it could be a very long time, but also in other environments, because it's not just the Russian military who presumably this is regarded as a problem. I mean, we've only been reporting the BBC in recent months the terrible situation in Myanmar, where the suggestions are that the military is committing crimes that would be regarded as war crimes.
I completely agree. Let me just take that in two bite-sized chunks. The first is that in Ukraine and with the Russian problem there, the way the Russian military is behaving, I think it's too late to change their structure and it's too late to train them, which leaves only consequences. And we need to support, as an international community, those Russian military who do understand the difference between right and wrong, and we need to give them the strength to say no. So I think alongside a more innovative and coordinated legal response, there needs to be an utterly joined up and organized and comprehensive advocacy campaign to show the Russian people what is being done in their name by their military. Now, the technical means exist to do that, but I think we've got to really concentrate on two messages. We've got to say to people, you need to stand up against the shameful way your beloved military is being used and behaving. And you need to combine that with, there will be an accounting for the behavior of people. Now, on the sort of wider piece, I absolutely agree. The international community, in my opinion, needs to take a long, hard look at its own structures of checks and balances. Russia doesn't recognize the ICC, has a Security Council veto. We need to look at those countries and institutions who enforce power, like PMCs, private military companies, gendarmeries, police, military, and we need to train them, and we need to make sure that they do have these checks and balances. Now, there are some levers we can use. Arms companies who sell weapons could make it a condition of selling weapons that they will teach them the right way and the wrong way to use that weapon. Funding support could come with conditions. You want to go on a UN mission, you must do legal training in the law of armed conflict. And that's exactly what my company was set up to try and do.
And you're involved in doing that right now. And we know, for example, that things like British lawyers are going into Ukraine, other countries are doing something. Can I just talk finally about your experience? I mean, you obviously care very much about the reputation of the armed forces and more generally of the military, I guess, beyond just your pride in this country. Presumably this sort of thing, I mean, we've got a picture of you, I think, in uniform as a young soldier. You have had a long career on the front. You have had to make some of these choices. How hard are they in moments of conflict for a soldier or indeed an officer on the ground to make these kinds of calls?
The answer is very, very difficult. It's very easy to press a trigger. It is very easy to press the trigger. It's much, much harder to make the decision not to press the trigger. And that is why you need the structure and the training to support you to do what your moral compass tells you is the right thing to do. And that then leads to your pride in your regiment and your pride in your military. What I see the Russian behavior doing is makes it very, very difficult for the Russian people to be proud of that if they knew what was taking place in their name.
Colonel James Stuart, thank you very much for talking to us. Colonel James from the company Pavocat, thank you very much for talking to us about that fascinating subject. I'm sure we will talk, I hope we will talk again more about the war crimes question in Ukraine.